Wyoming Territory, November 1879. The storm hit just past sundown, wild and loud as a freight train, when Adaline Sutton spotted the half-collapsed figure slumped beside the trail through the pine woods that bordered her land. She pulled hard on the reins. "Whoa, Nellie!" Her mare stopped, snorting against the wind. Adaline squinted through the sleet, heart thudding. There by the bend, half covered in snow and leaning against a crooked pine, was a man. His hat had blown off, his coat hung open, and his head drooped low like he had not the strength to lift it. "Sir?" she called over the wind. He did not stir. Adaline kicked her boots free of the stirrups and slid down, her coat flapping against her skirts. Snow soaked through her gloves as she knelt beside him. His face was pale, jaw dusted with dark stubble. His lips were cracked and his skin ice-cold. But he was breathing. "Help me out here," she muttered to no one in particular and gripped him under the arms. He groaned a low, broken sound and she nearly collapsed from relief. "You are not dying on me tonight, stranger." It took every ounce of her strength and a fair bit of cursing, but she managed to hoist him onto her mare, climbed up behind him, and rode the 2 miles back to her cabin with him slumped against her chest. By the time she kicked the door open and half-dragged, half-carried him inside, the storm was a deafening wall of white outside. She lowered him onto the cot near the fireplace, ripped off his soaked coat, and set to work stoking the fire until it roared. "Do not die," she said again, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. He looked young, mid-20s, maybe. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked with blood and snow. She found a gash beneath the fabric, cleaned it fast as she could, and wrapped it tight. Her hands trembled by the time she finished. He came around sometime after midnight. His lashes fluttered, and his gaze fixed on her with confusion. "Where?" "You are in my home. You collapsed outside. You were freezing and bleeding." He blinked slowly, then winced as he tried to sit up. "Do not." She pressed her hand to his chest. "You are safe now." He looked at her hand, then at her. "Name's Finley Boone," he rasped. "I was headed south. Horse spooked near the ridge and threw me. You were lucky I found you." His eyes softened. "Yeah, I reckon I am." Adaline cleared her throat and stood. "You need rest. I will make broth." She turned to the stove, but she could feel his eyes on her, tired but steady, and something in her chest twisted. She had lived alone in this cabin for over 2 years, ever since the sickness took her family back east and she came west to start over with what little she had. Alone had become normal, safe, necessary. But now this half-frozen cowboy had landed in her home, and something about the way he looked at her made the silence feel different. Not empty, just waiting. He slept through most of the next day. Adaline kept the fire going, fed him what she could coax him to eat, and tried not to watch him too closely. But when she caught him awake, his gaze always found hers. On the 3rd morning, she stepped outside to gather wood. The storm had passed. Snow lay thick and quiet, and the sun cut through the trees like gold. When she came back in, Finley was trying unsuccessfully to sit up. "You were stubborn," she said, setting the wood down. "Not stubborn," he grunted, "just tired of lying here watching you do everything." She crossed her arms. "You have a hole in your shoulder and nearly froze to death." He gave a crooked smile. "Still, feels wrong." She tilted her head. "How long were you out there before I found you?" "2 nights," he said, voice low. "Maybe 3. Got turned around after the horse threw me." "And you were alone?" He nodded. "Been alone a long while." There was something in the way he said it, flat, like it was just fact, but with a quiet ache underneath. Adaline moved closer. "You have no one waiting for you?" "No," he said. "No wife, no kin. Just me and the trail." He looked down at his hands. "But that night, when you found me, I thought that was it. I was ready for it to be over." She sat beside him on the cot. "But it is not over." His eyes met hers again. "No," he said softly. "It is not." The days that followed were slow but full. They fell into a rhythm, her tending the cabin, him helping in small ways as he healed. They talked more, laughed some, and when their hands brushed, neither pulled away. One night, she brought him a mug of tea and sat beside him by the fire. He watched the flames, then turned to her. "Why did you come out here? This place is not kind to folks alone." Adaline looked into the fire for a long moment. "My husband and baby girl died of fever in Virginia. There was nothing left for me there. My brother had a claim out here, but he never made it. I took it up instead." "I am sorry," he said. She nodded. "Me too." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Then she looked at him and said, "You were not ready to die. I saw that in you." He turned to her, his voice rough. "I was cold and tired, but when you touched me, I remembered what it felt like to want to live." Adaline's breath caught. He reached out, slow, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You brought me back." She leaned into his touch. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You are here now." He kissed her, then soft, sure, like he had been waiting his whole life to find her. And this time she did not pull away. By the second week, Finley could stand without swaying. He moved slow and careful, favoring his injured side, but the worst of the fever had passed. The wound had closed clean. He still woke sometimes with his jaw clenched and his breath ragged. But when Adaline lit the lantern each morning and handed him a tin cup of chicory coffee, he always met her eyes and said thank you like it meant more than just the drink. The snow had settled into deep silence outside, blanketing the woods and hills in a hush that made the world feel smaller, held together by the steady rhythm of survival. Inside the cabin, the days stretched soft and quiet. Chores filled the hours, splitting wood, boiling lye soap, patching the roof where wind had torn shingles loose. They worked side by side without needing to say much. But when they did speak, their words came easier than they used to. Adaline caught him staring at the map pinned to the wall one morning, a rough sketch of the Sweetwater River and the lands between there and Fort Bridger. "You thinking of heading that way?" she asked, brushing flour from her palms as she shaped the morning's bread dough. He leaned closer to the map. "Not sure yet. I was riding from Montana Territory. Thought I might try for the Colorado line, maybe see about work around Leadville. But that was before." She wiped her hands and crossed to stand beside him. "Before the storm?" Finley nodded slowly. "Before you." She didn't answer right away. The fire popped behind them and the scent of rising yeast hung warm in the air. "I never planned to have anyone else here," she said finally. "Didn't think I'd want it. I wouldn't stay where I'm not wanted." "I know." He turned to face her. But I'm not sure what it would mean if I did." His voice dropped low. "We don't have to name anything yet." Adaline looked up at him. "No, but I think I'd notice if you were gone." He reached for her hand then, his grip gentle. "I'd notice too." That evening she brought out a fiddle that had sat untouched on a shelf since she first arrived. Her father had taught her before the fever came. She hadn't played since burying him. Finley sat near the hearth, hands folded in his lap. "You play." "I used to." He didn't press. Just waited. She tucked the instrument under her chin and drew the bow across the strings. The first notes were tentative, wavering, but the sound filled the cabin like breath returning to long, empty lungs. She played slow, a tune that wandered like river water, melancholy but not mournful. When she finished, Finley's face was still, eyes thoughtful. "That was the prettiest sound I've heard in a long time." She set the fiddle down. "I didn't know if I still could." "You can." She hesitated. "When I play, it feels like someone I lost is still listening." He nodded. "Then keep playing." That night he stayed up after she'd gone to bed, sitting beside the fire with the map on his knees. The candle burned low, shadows dancing across his face. He traced the route south with one finger, then stopped. His hand hovered, uncertain. When dawn broke, he was already outside feeding the chickens. Adaline stepped onto the porch and watched him scatter seed with his left hand, the other arm still stiff. The cold had turned the snow to crust, and the trees creaked in the windless morning. "You're up early," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "Couldn't sleep." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "Thinking again?" Finley straightened. "Yeah, but the answer keeps feeling the same." She walked down the steps and met him in the yard. "And what's that?" "I don't want to go." Adaline studied his face. Then don't. He let out a long breath, like the choice had been waiting for permission. I'd stay if you asked. I am. He stepped closer. What would we be, out here? We'd be two people who found a way to keep going. He looked down at her then, a different kind of warmth in his expression. Not tentative, not borrowed, a steady kind. I want that. She reached for his hand, and this time she didn't let go. The wind picked up, rustling the pine boughs. Somewhere far off, a bird called out, but between them it was quiet and sure. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. The snow began to melt in the third week of December, first in trickling patches beneath the eaves and then down along the narrow run that wound through the trees west of the cabin. By midday, the sound of water moving again filled the air, slow and steady, like the land had begun to wake after a long silence. Adaline stood at the edge of her garden plot with a spade in hand, turning soil that hadn't been touched since the frost set in. She worked without rush, pressing her boot into the earth, lifting each clump and breaking it apart. Her hands were bare despite the cold, fingertips red but steady. Finley approached from the woods carrying a bundle of cedar boughs tied in rope. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his coat hung over one shoulder. His wound had stopped aching days ago, though he still moved with a degree of care, more out of habit than need now. "You're digging already?" he asked, setting the bundle down beside the shed. "It's soft enough," she said, not looking up. "Spring don't wait for anyone." He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked over, looking down at the row she'd started. "You planning to plant early?" "Just clearing what's dead. I like to see what's left." Finley crouched beside her. "I've always ridden out before planting time. Never stayed long enough to see anything grow." She pushed the spade into the earth again. "Then maybe it's time you did." He looked sideways at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You think I can make a farmer out of a man who's spent most of his life chasing cattle and keeping one eye on the sky? You've got 2 hands and a good heart." "That's more than most." Finley picked up a clump of dried root she tossed aside and turned it over in his palm. "You talk like you expect me to stay." She glanced at him then. "You said you would." "I did," he said, "and I meant it." That night, Adaline lit a single lantern and laid out a small pile of letters near the fire. Yellowed envelopes, edges worn soft from handling. She didn't speak until Finley eased into the chair opposite hers. "They're from my cousin, back in Richmond," she said. "Only person who still writes." He watched her fingertips slide one letter free. "You read them often?" "Not since autumn." She unfolded the paper, read a few lines, then folded it again. "I used to think I was forgetting how to speak with people. Like all my words had dried up." "They haven't," he said quietly. She looked across at him. "You don't feel strange, being here with me? After everything you've seen?" Finley leaned forward, elbows on knees. "There's been years it felt like I was walking beside my own shadow. Camps, cattle drives, nights I didn't speak to another soul. But this." He gestured around them. "It feels like I stepped back into something I didn't know I wanted." Adaline nodded once, her eyes steady. "It's quiet here. It's the kind of quiet that listens." She opened another letter but didn't read it. "You miss anything from the trail?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes I miss the way the stars look out past Cheyenne, like you could fall straight into them. But I don't miss the cold, or the ache in my bones from sleeping on hard ground." She leaned back, her voice softer. "Have you ever stayed through winter before?" "No," he said. "But I think I'd like to." The lantern flickered low as the wind picked up outside, brushing against the cabin like a sigh. Finley stood and moved toward the stove, added another log, then turned. "There's something I've been thinking on," he said, voice low but clear. Adaline folded the last letter and met his eyes. "I don't want to just be a guest in your life." "You're not." He stepped closer. "I mean, if I'm staying, I want to build something with you, not just stand beside it." She didn't speak right away. Her face was unreadable for a long moment until she pushed the letters aside and stood. "Then you should see something." She led him to the back room where a small cedar chest sat beneath the window. She knelt, opened it, and pulled out a folded piece of canvas. Inside was a set of plans drawn by hand, measurements, sketches of walls and shelves, a second room added beside the first. I started this last spring. Thought I might add on come summer, but I didn't have the help. Finley crouched beside her, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. You were going to build this alone? I would have tried. He looked at her, voice low. Let's do it together. Adaline pressed the paper flat, her hand resting near his. You mean it? I do. They sat like that a long time, the weight of the moment settling between them. Not heavy, but rooted like something put down into the earth and ready to stay. Outside, the moon rose through thinning clouds, casting pale light across the trees. Inside, the warmth grew quiet and steady, not from the fire, but from something older and more enduring. She reached for his hand, and when he laced his fingers with hers, it felt like the first stone laid in a foundation that would hold. By New Year's Eve, the pine along the ridge was shedding needles, and the creek behind the cabin had begun to run clear beneath its crust of ice. The thaw was early, but Adaline had seen stranger winters in Wyoming territory. Still, when she stepped onto the porch that morning and tasted the iron-sweet air, she knew the season was turning. Finley was already in the lean-to, sawing planks they'd hewn from the cedar he'd dragged in weeks ago. His breath hung thick in the chill, but he worked without pause. She didn't interrupt until she saw the raw patch on his palm where the handle had rubbed the skin red. Let me see that hand, she said as she crossed the yard. He leaned back on his heels, setting the saw aside. It's nothing. She reached for his wrist. It's not nothing. You'll split it open if you keep on. He let her examine it, quiet, the way he always went still when her fingertips touched skin he hadn't meant to show. I'll wrap it, she said, not asking. He followed her inside without a word. Once they'd settled near the wash basin, she dampened a strip of muslin and wound it around his palm with practiced care. He watched her hands instead of her face, but she could feel the question in him building. What is it? She asked softly. He looked up then, eyes steady. I've been thinking about March. She tied the muslin off, her fingers brushing his knuckles. What about it? Planting. Lumber. The second room. I want to make sure I stay ahead of it. Adaline reached for the tin box on the shelf and tucked the leftover bandage inside. You're not behind. He stood and moved toward the hearth, resting one hand on the mantel. I've never built something that wasn't meant to be left behind. She crossed the floor slowly and stood beside him. This isn't something to leave. He turned to her, the firelight catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. When I rode out of Montana, I didn't expect to survive the month. I had no plans past the next sunrise. I know. He hesitated. But I think I'd like to plan something now. She folded her arms. You mean more than the room? He nodded. I've been saving coin the last few years. Took work where I could. Stayed sober, stayed out of trouble. I figured maybe I'd get a piece of land somewhere. But it never felt like a place to stop. Her voice was quiet. And this does. Finley reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch. He opened it slowly, revealing a narrow silver ring with a smooth band and no decoration. I bought this in Helena 2 years back. Just kept it. I didn't know why. Adaline didn't move. I don't have fancy words, he said, holding the ring out flat in his calloused palm. But I want to stay. I want to build this with you. She looked at the ring, then at him. I never thought I'd be asked again. You don't have to answer now. She lifted her hand and closed his fingers gently around the ring. You're not just asking to stay. You're asking to belong. I am. She stepped closer. Then you already do. Outside, the sky went soft with dusk, the first stars pressing through the purple veil of evening. Inside the cabin, the fire gave off a low, even glow. Adaline reached for the pouch and took the ring from his hand. If you're staying, you'll need a better shirt come spring. You'll need boots that don't leak. I figured as much, he said, half smiling. She slid the ring onto her finger. It was a touch loose, but she didn't mind. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping as if a weight had finally left him. I've never had anyone say yes. Adaline took his hand in both of hers. Then it's time you heard it. And there, in the quiet hush between winter's end and the year's beginning, Finley Boone found what he hadn't dared to hope for, something worth staying for, and someone who chose him not out of pity or need, but with quiet, unwavering faith. They stood in silence, the soft warmth of the room pressing close. No more storms, no more running. Just the slow settling of roots, the promise of work ahead, and the certainty of hands held fast. By late February, the cabin's new room stood framed and roofed, its fresh pine boards pale against the older timber. The walls still needed chinking, and the window hadn't yet been fitted, but it was real, 4 walls raised by 2 hands with matching calluses. On the inside wall, Adaline had penciled a small mark waist high, then dated it. Finley had watched her do it without asking why. He understood. Some things needed to be remembered as they were when they began. That morning, she stood at the table sewing a hem into a pair of trousers she'd taken in for him. The fabric had been salvaged from a bundle of goods traded with a passing trapper, sturdy and clean, if a little coarse. Finley sat across from her, sharpening the blade of a drawknife, his movements slow and deliberate. "You ever think about what you'd have done if you hadn't come west?" she asked, not glancing up. He paused, holding the blade to the light. "I thought about it once. Wasn't much left to hold me where I came from. My father drank through most of my childhood. My mother died before I could understand what it meant. I left before I turned 17. Adaline's needle paused in the fabric. "That's young. I figured I'd rather be alone on my own terms." She nodded faintly. "You ever go back?" "Once. My father had passed by then. The house was gone. I stood where it had been, and it didn't feel like anything." She tied off the thread and set the garment aside. "I went back to Richmond once. After the war. Just to see. The street my family lived on was burned out. My cousin offered to let me stay, but everything felt emptied." Finley met her eyes. "So you came here." "I didn't come to forget. I came to begin." He set the drawknife down and stood. "You think we've begun, then?" "I do." She stepped around the table, resting her hand lightly against his chest. "This feels like something that's meant to last." That afternoon, they walked the land together, down the slope to the creek, over the rise where the soil ran dark and rich. The snow had thinned to wet patches beneath the brush, and the air smelled of moss and thawing bark. Adaline carried a small sack of seed potatoes they'd bartered for from a neighbor to the east. She marked the rows with string while Finley drove stakes into the softening ground. They worked without hurry, their movements easy beside one another. When the last stake was in place, Finley drew her hand into his. "We'll need another line for corn," he said. "Maybe further from the trees." Adaline smiled up at him. "And room for beans." "I've got a mind to grow enough to store this year." He brushed his thumb over her knuckles. "I already feel like we've been doing this a long time." "Maybe we have," she said. "Just not in the same place before now." That night, they sat by the small table with bowls of lentils and onions, a heel of bread between them. The oil lamp flickered low, casting long shadows along the floorboards. Finley reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I wrote something," he said. "Didn't know if I'd show it to you." She raised a brow. "You write?" "Only just started. Thought maybe I'd say it out loud instead." She leaned her elbows on the table, chin in her hand. "I'm listening." He cleared his throat, then began. "I once thought I was meant for the road, that I was made out of miles and silence and whatever keeps a man moving even when he's near worn through. But I was wrong. I was only waiting. For a warm place. For a name I wanted to say in the dark. For you." Adaline's eyes didn't leave him. He folded the paper again. "Wasn't much. But it's true." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "You've given me more than I ever expected." They didn't say anything more after that. They didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the last of the frost melted from the roofline. The stream ran faster. Wild geese passed overhead in pairs. Adaline planted rows of kale and beans, and Finley built a small coop for the hens she planned to raise come May. They fell asleep each night with the window cracked open, the air cool but promising. Each morning, they woke beside one another with the sun casting gold across the floor. On the first Sunday of April, they walked to the chapel outside Emigrant Gap, where the preacher kept a small ledger and a quiet voice. They wore their cleanest clothes. Finley shaved and combed his hair. Adaline pinned her curls beneath a woven bonnet she'd never worn before. They spoke their vows in plain words, hands clasped tight, eyes steady. No guests. No music. Just the spring wind through the cottonwoods and the slow toll of the bell as they stepped back out into the light. They returned home that evening, hand in hand, and shared a pot of stew that had simmered all day. Finley carved their initials into the post by the cabin door. Adaline pressed her palm over his when he finished. Together, they watched the last light fade behind the ridge. That night, they lay close beneath the quilt she'd sewn their first winter, the faint scent of cedar still rising from the walls of the room they'd built with their own hands. And in that quiet, in that warmth, they became more than two people who had survived. They became one life shared, built not from what had been taken, but from what they chose to keep. Years later, the garden would stretch wide with rows of vegetables. The coop would house a dozen hens. The cabin would hold more than memory. It would hold laughter and music and the sound of footsteps on worn wood. And every spring, when the thaw returned, Adaline would run her fingers over the mark on the wall dated that 1st February, and Finley would kiss the inside of her wrist just once and say, "We began here." And she would answer, "And we stayed."